What you're seeing, this is Sharon Kellam, and this is the last of my U2 Wear Who Hat story. But we're going to segue just a little bit from the Wear Who Hat and show you this floating keyboard that an artistic welder friend of mine created a number of years ago, and I was privy and privileged and thrilled to be able to be the recipient of this. It hung in a museum in Winston for a while, but she gave it to me. As you can see, it's keys from a piano, and she created with metal what looks to be a staff, the 5 lines and 4 spaces. So it is a floating keyboard that is on the wall in my bedroom, and I take pleasure in seeing this every time I walk up the steps and, whenever I'm up here. It is just gorgeous, and I love it. And I thought you would enjoy seeing. It certainly represents all the music, a lot of the music in my life. I was a piano first applied piano and voice for a while at Greensboro College. And so the keyboard's very, very important to me. And this is a very old friend, goes back to high school, college, and very close friend of mine. So on 2 accounts, it's a valuable piece of art object that's on the wall, and it's between the 2 skylights that I created up here in my bedroom. So it's especially lovely. And that's the floating keyboard. Now to go on with my Wear Who hat. My Wear Who hat, if you recall, this is the Wear Who hat, and we're into motorcycling now. One of the pins is an XL Plus pin, and the XL is 4, as you know. And so it's 40 plus. It meant people over 40 motorcycling. And when I first started, I was 40. And I was able to join in this little group that was called XL Plus, and it was people over 40 motorcycling. It was a very interesting group of older people. And then the other pins are kind of grouped together. When we went on rallies, we would get a pin. And we didn't go on that many, but over a period of a couple of years, there were several. And so these are different pins. Motor Maids is especially this little red one here. I wish it had been, we wore a blue jacket and white gloves, but the pin itself there is gold and red, and Motor Maids. It was a group of women. After I started riding, I found there were these women that rode one up by themselves, didn't ride behind somebody, and they rode as a group and had their own little special group, and it was just wonderful. So I was interviewed, and they accepted me, and so I was, for a couple of years, I was in Motor Maids, and they would rally. Once a year they'd have a rally somewhere in the United States, and I just got real lucky, and the second year that I was in, they had a rally in Boone, North Carolina, which is not that far away from Greensboro. So I was able to come up on my Yamaha, Kickstart Yamaha 400, and somewhere on here I have a little Yamaha. Here it is. It's way around here. I do have a tiny little, it's hard to see this pen, it's a Yamaha, it says Yamaha. That's what I had, a 400 Kickstart. And since my inseam is only 28 inches, there it is. My inseam is only 28 inches. We had to there were no shocks at all. We just had to lower it as far as we could lower it. And then I still had to take my boots to a cobbler who put heels on them and built them up so that I was tall enough to be able to actually barely get on this motorcycle. It was almost funny, me getting on. And no shocks, no padding. One time I was in such pain, I stopped, and they were having a yard sale somewhere, and jumped off, and there was this old quilt, old beat up quilt, and I think the people wanted $1 for it. And I don't think I've ever made a better purchase in my life than that old beat up quilt for $1, because I was able to fold it and use it almost like a horse blanket. And it gave me a little bit of padding, a little bit of relief. And I just had many wonderful experiences with these people that I met and riding. When we stopped in Boone, we had a rally through Boone on River Street and down King Street and then River Street. And the mayor of Boone at that time rode a motorcycle, and so he was pleased to lead the parade, which was really exciting. But all the rest, we were women that were riding these motorcycles very, very slowly. And I remember a co-ed, a girl, who was on an upstairs apartment on River Street, and I can remember her screaming and jumping up and down and hollering, "I love it, I love it, I love it," because it was all women on motorcycles, and no men except for the mayor that was leading the parade. And that was just a lot of fun. I met a woman who did a lot of riding all over the country, and she stayed in national parks and always slept with one hand on her pistol and her foot on her bike, and had put a sleeping bag on the ground. She was a BMW rider, a Beamer, and she had a kickstart Beamer, loaded, beautiful bike, gorgeous. She liked that kickstart part of it. I think she had an electric start also, but she usually kicked it off. And the rally I went to in Boone was especially interesting because there were a couple of women, well, almost all of them came in with loaded bikes. I mean, these were very expensive motorcycles. And there were two women that came in, one a grandma and one a great-grandma, I think is the way that worked. And they came out of Florida on their pink Harleys and dyed red hair. They were a sight in this world. But they came in, and I think there was a younger girl that rode, but she had to work. In fact, many of the women that were there were older because the younger women had to stay and work their jobs. They weren't privy to just going to a rally, as some of the older ones were. And I also met a woman who wrote a book about riding the perimeter of the United States. Now, she had a Goldwing, and she rode the perimeter and timed it so that she was up north coming in the summertime. And her children, her husband had died. They had planned on doing this, but he died. And she decided that she was going to go ahead and do it by herself. And her grandchildren and children just had a fit. Said, "You're just too old, you can't do this." Well, that was like a red flag. She did it anyway and wrote a book about it. And it was a marvelous, uplifting book talking about all the people that helped her all along the way and all the experiences she had. I don't think there were anything but just positive experiences. And it just gave you a lot of hope and trust and belief in mainstream America. Most of what we see on TV and radio is not mainstream, and we forget how most of the people live and how they are in this country, but obviously there were people all along the way that were willing to help her. And I think most of her riding didn't take place on interstates. Most of her riding, she was on what we call blue highways. And they were good roads, but they were roads where the common people, little small towns she was going to go through, and where she could get help if she broke down. And she did. Many times they put her up for the night, and helped her all along the way. So those are my motorcycle pins for my book, my Wear Who Hat book. Now, the last pin on my hat is something that says, "The difference in our salaries." As two little babies looking in their diapers. It says, "Oh, that explains the difference in our salaries." Well, I just love that because I certainly have had experience, and there is the pin right here, this white round pin. I've had most unhappy experiences all through my life of being discriminated against because I was a woman. And we still do not have the we still have not passed the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment for women. The laws are all on the books, but many of the states do not uphold those laws. It's like we did the black people in the 50s and the early 60s. And finally, we were able to get federal to come in and say, no, 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 you've got to uphold the law of the land. Whether you like it or not, you've got to treat them right. And they need to say that to women, so that if you're in a state like I'm in, North Carolina, and there's discrimination, I would be able to get bite behind the law to come down on the state to say, you can't treat her like that. You can't discriminate just because she's female. And I'm not sure I'll live long enough to see the time lapse so that we can have another amendment to try and pass the Equal Rights Amendment. Tragically, it did not pass. And North Carolina is the swing state that voted it down. And I'm very ashamed that we did that, but we did. And we just seem to be truly living up to our name, which goes back in history. We are called the Rip Van Winkle State. We were a veil of humility between two mountains of conceit, is the way they phrased it. We sat between Virginia and South Carolina. And if you know anything about the history of this country, Virginia and South Carolina always felt that they were way, way, way educated and a cut above North Carolina, that we were nothing except just stupid people running around in the woods here with no education and no ability to do anything. And they just really looked down on us. And we were called the Rip Van Winkle State. And I guess today we still are, because we're lagging way down at the bottom in so many, many ways still in this state. And I'm sorry. I wish we would do better. We have the oldest supported state university in the entire country, Chapel Hill, and yet we are so, and have fine higher education universities, but we certainly lag behind in so many other ways. Anyway, these are my hats, and the children have always enjoyed, and adults enjoyed, all the stories on my hats as they went through. And when we got to the end, then we would take a piece of newspaper and we would fold it and make some kind of a little sailor's cap or a three-pointed hat or something out of the newspaper, and they would write in a marker something about themselves and say one or two little things about who they were and where they came from, and they would have a Where Who hat also. Thank you for listening to my stories. I hope you've enjoyed all of these stories of the pins on my hat and my little book. Thank you. Goodbye.